Hello again. Good to see you. Thank you for joining me on English 360. And we're going to talk about one very important element of grammar this day. Today, we want to consider what conditional sentences are. We'll also look at their forms or their types and how each of these types is formed. Let's begin. But before then, don't forget to subscribe or like this video or share the video with your friends. Thank you for doing just that. What then do we refer to as conditional sentences? Well, conditional sentences are grammatical structures that include statements that express conditional situations, or they include statements that express hypothetical situations. What do we mean by hypothetical situations? These are sometimes assumptions that are not based on facts or true events. In English grammar, these sentences have two main clauses. We have the first clause that is referred to as the main clause, and the second, the subordinate clause. The main clause can also be known as the independent clause, whereas the subordinate clause can be called the if clause. Yes, or the dependent clause. Now, this subordinate clause or the dependent clause or the if clause is the one that sets the condition and typically begins with if, which we can refer to, as I said, as the conditional word which introduces the subordinate clause. There are other conditional words that can be used in English. Some of these are unless, should, in case, when, and condition that, which is an expression, and so on and so forth. In English, usually the subordinate clause is called the if clause. So you often hear the if clause, the if clause. It can come before or after the main clause. Now, the main clause of the sentence is the sentence, or it's the clause that states the result of the consequence. I repeat, the main clause of the sentence is the clause that states the result of or of the consequence of the action. Now, if the subordinate clause is at the beginning of a conditional sentence, then there should be a comma that is required after that clause. Take note, anytime you are writing and that subordinate clause is at the beginning of the sentence or of the conditional sentence, then there should be a comma after the subordinate clause. However, no comma is required if the subordinate clause is at the second place or the second position of the sentence. For example, if you are late now, you will not be able to eat supper. If you are late now, you will not be able to eat supper. You will realize in this sentence that the subordinate clause or the if clause or the conditional clause begins this conditional sentence. So the first part of the sentence, which is, if you are late now, After noun, there should be a mandatory comma in writing, my dear students, very important. But should we reverse a sentence and say, you will not be able, also, you will not be able to eat supper if you are late now? In this case, because the main clause, which or the principal clause or the main clause, which is stating the result of the consequence, is beginning the sentence, you will not have to bring a comma after supper, which ends that particular clause. I hope you get it. So we always use a mandatory comma when the subordinate clause begins and separates what the subordinate clause from the main clause. That's very important. Now let us find out how many types of conditional clauses do we have. Are there different types of conditional sentences? Yes. In English, we can identify four different types of conditional sentences. What are they? We have the zero conditional sentence, the first conditional sentence, the second conditional sentence, and lastly, the third conditional sentence. In this last aspect, we want to consider the first two of the types, which are the zero conditional sentences and the first conditional sentences. What are zero conditional sentences? To begin, well, for this first type, as the name suggests, zero conditional sentences, these are conditional sentences that express general truths or known facts as well as things that occur regularly. Usually, both clauses have their verb elements expressed in the simple present tense. This means that the verb element in the if clause is expressed in the present, and at the same time, the verb element in the main clause or the principal clause is also being expressed in the present simple tense. As a general rule for remembrance, dear student, we can give this rule as if plus present plus present. This means that the verb element in the if clause will be in the present, and same is expressed in the main clause. Brilliant. But can we look at two examples to explain this phenomenon? That would be lovely, won't it? For example, if you eat late, you have a bad sleep. If you eat late, you have a bad sleep. You realize that the subordinate clause is if you eat late. What is the verb in this clause? Is eat. Is expressing what tense? The present. Then we go to the main verb or main clause. The verb element in this main clause is have. In what tense is it expressed? Is it the present? Yes, you answer rightly. The main clause too has its verb element expressed in the simple present tense. That is how the zero conditional sentence is structured. Let's look at a second example. If you add sugar to coffee, it becomes sweet. Come on, if you add sugar to coffee, it becomes sweet. The verb element in the if clause is add. if you add, add, simple present tense, and the verb element in the second clause, which is the principal clause, is what? Becomes excellent. That is how we can have the verb element expressed in the present, followed by another present. Can we take a last example in the series? It gets dark outside when the sun sets. As we indicated earlier, we can use when. And so when I say when, it's also used here to express a condition. You realize the verb element in the if clause is in the present. And what's that verb element? Gets. Because we said it gets. In here, you realize that we begin the conditional sentence with the principal clause. So there will be no need bringing a comma after we said dark outside. If it gets dark outside when the sun sets. The verb is also expressed in the present tense in the conditional clause. Well done. We would like to look at the third or the second type. Yes, the second type of conditional sentences. Remember, we identified 4 of them. And I said in this video, we'll look at what? 2 types. So the second type is the first conditional sentence. What are the first conditional sentences? These conditional sentences, dear students, express realistic future situations contingent on something else happening. I repeat, first conditional sentences are sentences that express realistic future situations, but these realistic future situations are contingent or based on something else happening. So if something doesn't happen, this realistic future wouldn't take place. Now, it's important to note that the subordinate clause of the first conditional sentences are expressed in the present tense, but the main clause, the verb element, is being expressed in the future. And usually we use modal verb elements like will or shall to express the future. So as a general rule, we may say the first conditional sentences are formed using the main conditional word, which you know to be if, plus present to make the conditional clause, and future tense to make the main clause. So we have if plus present plus future. That gives you the future clause. And as a general rule, this becomes the first conditional sentence. Let's look at 2 examples of 3 if time allows. The first example will be, if it rains, I will sow my crops. So what is the first clause? If it rains. That is the first clause, or known as the subordinate clause or the if clause. You realize the verb element in this clause is expressed in the present. So we have if plus present. Let's go to the second clause. I will sow my crops. Don't forget, there should be a mandatory comma between the if clause and the main clause, because the if clause begins a conditional sentence. In the second clause, which is the main clause or the principal clause, We have I will sow my crops. What's the verb element? It's not only will, nor or is it only so. The verb element is a combination of the will, which is the modal verb, and the lexical verb so in the bare infinitive, will so. So will so becomes a future tense. Let's look at the second example. The students will pass the exams if they study hard enough. The students will pass the exams. But is it certain? Is their passing of the exam certain? Is it definite? Are we sure on that? We're not sure of it. So the passing of their exams is contingent upon or based upon something else happening. What is that? That is, if they study hard. So on condition that they study hard, they will not pass the exam. That is the meaning. That's the implication. So the first conditional sentence type helps you to know that we can only express a realistic future only when a situation happens before them. Thank you very much if you have enjoyed this part of the discussion. In our next lesson, we'll consider the third and the second conditional sentences. Yes, we'll look at the second and the third conditional sentences, how they are structured and how they are used in English. Let me see you in the next video then.